right? And say welcome to those of you joining us today, both live right now, today, a week or so before Christmas, and to those of you who are joining us in the future on YouTube as well. My name is Jamie Viebach, and I am the Will County Director of the Conservation Foundation. Everybody's muted, your cameras are off, but we have changed up the chat if you're joining us live so that you can all chat with each other as well as us. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, so you can enjoy it later if you want to come back, show it to somebody else, refer people, and that goes to all of our webinars too. So while you're bored on Christmas break or whatever, if you want to go back and watch some of the webinars you missed, they are all stored there for you to enjoy. If you have any questions, you can use the chat, you can use the Q&A box, however you see fit. But for your safety, I will say, only click anything that Brandon or I might post in the chat. If some random person sends you a link, maybe you want to hold off on clicking that. On the TCF side of things, these webinars are offered to the public for free, but we do encourage you to consider a donation or a membership, because the more people we have attending, the more it costs us to run them. And we are running these into the new year, so yay. As long as people keep attending, I will keep doing them. So, but at the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a page with some resources, although since I set it up wrong, probably not. But check out our website. Feel free to make a donation, become a member. We are still working with our generous donor who is matching all new donations through the end of the year. So we got just a couple weeks left of this. They have, because we hit that $75,000 level, they have now bumped it up to $100,000. So if you donate $25, we will get $50. So great way to double the impact of your end of year donations. As I mentioned, our plans are to do them into next year. So this is the last one for 2020. We will be putting together a huge slate of exciting new webinars for the new year. And let me tell you, I got them scheduled almost through the end of February. We've got some really cool special guests that I'm not going to tell you about just yet, but we have some really awesome ones coming up. Ones that I can tell you about, we're going to be talking about mushrooms. Our friend Connie, who talked about wild edibles, native edibles that you could have in your yard, is going to be talking about mushrooms. So that one's going to be really cool. My friend Amy is coming in to talk about biomimicry, which is a really awesome topic. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. It is so cool. The whole concept of it, building things to mimic nature. It's awesome. What else do we have? Shut Aquarium is going to talk about microplastics. We just got everything coming up for you, let me tell you. Awesome, awesome stuff. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Brandon, who's going to do some storytelling today.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Hello, everybody. I'm Brandon Hayes. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a moment. And it's funny, you know, taking over the conversation from Jamie's introduction in, you know, thinking about sort of microplastics and thinking about you know, mushrooms and different species and things like that. And I think for today, for this final webinar of the year, for this day where it did snow this morning here in the city of Chicago, so it feels Christmassy along with the gloominess. We do want to share some stories, so it's a time to kind of sit back. I have a mug of tea in my Theodore Roosevelt mug, and we're going to share some stories today, kind of relax into this time of year. And I want to begin, there we go. I want to begin with the land acknowledgement. We honor the land of the Chicago region as the traditional home of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki, also called this area home. We celebrate their traditions and their culture and their immemorial ties to this land. Land acknowledgement statements like this are designed to bring more awareness and understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples and their territories. But they should also be more than that. They should be a call for us to rethink our relationship with the environment and the histories of all peoples. And with that, our first story today is a Zuni story from the Native American tribe that lives along the Little Colorado River in Arizona. It's called The Coyote and the Beetle. In remote times, after our ancients were settled at Middle Ant Hill, a little thing occurred which will explain a great deal. My children, you have doubtless seen the tip beetles. They run around on smooth, hard patches of ground in springtime and early summer, kicking their heels into the air and thrusting their heads into any crack or hole they find. Well, in ancient times, on the pathway leading around to Fat Mountain, there was one of these beetles running around in all directions in the sunshine when a coyote came trotting along. He pricked up his ears, lowered his nose, arched his neck, then stuck out his paw toward the beetle. "Ha," said he, "I shall bite you." The beetle immediately stuck his head down close to the ground and lifting one of his antennae deprecatingly exclaimed, hold on, friend, wait a bit. For the love of mercy, I hear something very strange down there below." "Humph," replied the coyote, "what do you hear?" "Hush, hush," cried the beetle, which is with his head still to the ground. "Listen." So Coyote drew back and listened most attentively. By and by, the beetle lifted himself with a long sigh of relief. "Okay," exclaimed the coyote. "What was going on?" "The good souls save us," exclaimed the beetle with a shake of his head. "I heard them saying down there that tomorrow they would chase away and thoroughly chastise everybody who defiled the public trails of this country, and they are making ready as fast as they can." "Souls of my ancestors," cried the coyote, "I have been loitering along this trail this very morning and have defiled it repeatedly. I'll cut." And away he ran as fast as he could go. The beetle, in pure exuberance of spirits, turned somersaults and stuck his head in the sand until it was quite turned. Thus did the beetle in the days of the ancients save himself from being bitten. Consequently, the tip beetle has that strange habit of kicking his heels into the air and sticking his head into the sand. Thus shortens my story. And that was recorded by Frank Hamilton Cushing and published in 1901 in his Zuni Coyote Tales. So I would love to, in the chat, invite you to think about the story and share what you think the moral of the story is, what the takeaway of the story is. So go ahead and, we see all the great, chats of everybody from where you're joining us from. So let's take a moment and think about and share in the chat what the moral of the story is. And while we're doing that, we'll think a little bit about the coyote stories. That Coyote and his stories in the Native American tradition go back at least 13,000 years, probably longer than that. And making Coyote and the sort of anthropomorphized coyote character one of the oldest characters in all of world literature. But what do we think the takeaway of the story is? And make sure that you're sharing your thoughts with both the panelists and attendees. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Just wondering what people kind of take from it. Jamie, I see you came back on.
Yeah, while people are typing away, I just want to say I love coyote stories. I spent 4 years working at Isle Cache Museum in Romeoville, and we talked a lot about the Native people who lived here and their stories because, when you're working with kids, animal stories are a great way to bring them in. And there's just so many great origin stories and stories of different animals tricking the trickster, as it were.
Yes.
So
I love it. Like this, like beetle tricking coyote.
Exactly. So I would say like my takeaway from this would be thinking, the need to think on your feet, and instead of trying to outmuscle someone who is greatly outmatching you, using brain to defeat brawn.
I love that. And I quite agree. And I love that Coyote often prides himself on being clever. And in this story, he is tricked by Beetle, who's able to think on his feet. We have a takeaway from Barb. She says, "My takeaway is that we all have a place in the great design of life." I like that too, the idea of the origin story and explanations for natural phenomenon, which is often where sort of nature in storytelling begins. One of the things that also jumps out at me about this story, I don't think it's the key theme, but I think it's a fun little piece, is the idea of chastising everybody who has defiled the public trails of this country. I think all of us who have backgrounds or work in conservation or enjoy the outdoors can understand the idea of not defiling shared spaces and shared lands. We have another one from Jean. "I guess I'm thinking more about why the beetle kicks up his feet and hides its head in the sand rather than the moral," which goes right along with that idea of explaining natural phenomenon. The coyotes and beetles have important interactions and importance in that region, and important interactions are not limited to only humans. It's somewhat like the hare and the tortoise story, exactly. And I like the idea of there being no humans in the story that Sandra picks up on also. So please keep sharing your thoughts about the coyote and the beetle. But I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit about me and who I am sharing this story with you. So I'm Brandon Hayes, and I'm with Bold Bison Communications and Consulting. And my background is communications in the not-for-profit sector. So I've done stuff in the theater, the Goodman Theater here in Chicago. I was a publicist there with youth arts at an organization called Marwin here in the city, and then at Open Lands, which is a conservation organization and land trust here in the Chicago region, before starting my own firm, Bold Bison. So that's sort of like the professional behind the scenes kind of expertise that I bring to our storytelling and conversation today. And where we want to go today is talk a bit about stories. I'm going to share some resources, some ways to think about storytelling. I'm going to share with you some stories from nature, from some of my experiences in nature, and then thread some of those stories through some of these tools for thinking about storytelling. And with your feedback, we hope to have a lively chat today and get a sense of constructing a story and thinking about nature, and just having a good afternoon for the next hour and change. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and Jamie can lift them up. We can hold them to the end perhaps, or at the end of each story. We'll just kind of keep it a little bit free flow. So not a long time before I decided to actually share this photo with you. That is me in a Phantom of the Opera t-shirt. The year is 1992. The location is the South Rim of the Grand Canyon. And that's my aunt and my cousins. And this was my first national park. And it was sort of a monumental experience for me. I was just ended 8th grade, was about to start high school, and went with my family in California to Arizona to this national park, which was bowled me over as this kid growing up in Detroit, who had never seen quite anything like this. And I know that is often the reaction that folks have when they first experience, great nature, the national park, sublime nature. And so fast forward a number of years to 2010, and my husband and I were at a wedding in Akron, Ohio, and we were looking out from our hotel room over Akron at this expansive green out, north of us. And I said to him, I bet that's Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And I said, before we head back to Chicago tomorrow, can we get up maybe an hour earlier, at least drive through the national park on the way home? Because, when I was a kid, after going to the Grand Canyon and the following year to Yosemite, I always assumed that I would visit all of the national parks. It was just something that I thought would happen in my life. And I'd been to a few others since then. But, as we were driving through Cuyahoga Valley National Park the next day, I turned to Sean and I said, already in our 30s, well, if I'm going to visit all the national parks, maybe I should get going on that project. What do you think? And he at the time said, oh, that sounds great, having no idea what he was getting himself into, that would involve all sorts of trips, to, we haven't gone there yet, but above the Arctic Circle, to American Samoa, to all sorts of places across the United States. To date, we have visited 33 national parks. They're there on the screen, the ones that we've been to. Before in 2020, we put the journey on pause and waiting to hopefully get to a national park next fall in Acadia, when we have another friend's wedding out on Cape Cod. So those are the parks we've been to. I'm curious in the chat as we go and I continue introducing myself to you, curious about people's favorite national parks, people who have been to national parks. So please feel free to share in the chat any national parks you've been to, some of your favorite national parks. We would love to get a sense of sort of where people have been. But Sean and I have been to 33 of the 62 national parks. And speaking of storytelling, a little bit more about me, I do write about the parks and post my photographs of the parks on a blog called As They Are, Exploring the National Parks. The name comes from, it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, when he first stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon and he looked into it for the first time shortly after becoming president, when he was on a whistle-stop tour of the United States after the assassination of President McKinley, and he was risen to the White House, and he looked into it and he says, leave it as it is. Man, the ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Leave it as it is the one great sight that all Americans, if they can travel at all, should see. So hence the name of the site, As They Are, as we are exploring the national parks. And then also you can follow me on Instagram before we move into the stories, where I basically do nothing but post photos of the national parks. I am at Out in the Parks on Instagram. Oh, and then also Out in the Parks is a site where I feature my photos. Okay, let's get through that. I want to tell you another story that doesn't involve the national parks. It doesn't involve that sort of idea of these 62 amazing places, in the United States where sort of nature lives. So I want to talk a little bit about nature closer to home. And picture it in this story. Sean and I are dressed in day hiking gear. We're in our boots. We're wearing our backpacks. It's a beautiful July day, beautiful sunny, balmy, not too hot July day in Chicago. And we're walking up the sidewalk of our north side neighborhood toward our building. We live in a 3-flat on the north side. And as we're walking up the walk to the front of our building, our downstairs neighbor comes out of the front door. And she lives below us with her husband. They have a young son. They had moved to the city a few years earlier. And from New Haven, he works at the University of Chicago. She grew up in Pennsylvania. He's from out east. And she looks at us. And she's maybe 35, and she looks at us and she says, it looks like the two of you have been hiking. And we said, yes, we were down at Medeo National Tallgrass Prairie down in Will County. And she replied, we love hiking, but we didn't think there was anywhere to go hiking in the Midwest. And I, at the time, working for a conservation organization, thought, oh boy, I have my work cut out for me more than I ever thought that I did. When somebody who, purports to love getting outside and getting out into nature, loves to go hiking, doesn't understand all the great places to get outside in our region. And Medeo is amazing for those of you who have not been there. I trust Jamie has, being down in Will County. They have a reintroduced bison herd. It was the former Joliet Arsenal army ammunition plant. and was converted to the nation's first national tallgrass prairie 25 years ago. It's coming up on its 25th anniversary, and has reintroduced bison herd there that's helping in the prairie restoration at the site. So there is my little sort of nugget of a story, and I want to run this nugget of a story through. Oh, sorry, missed one beat. Now let's shift as we begin to talk about the structure of that bit of story that I just told. And if you can switch from sharing in the chat your favorite national parks, and I see we've got this amazing conversation going. And Jamie, I definitely want a copy of the chat when this is all done. But for those of you in the Chicago region, or for those of you who are joining us from Canada or from Greece, if you want to share some special places to get outside that are closer to where you live, that aren't, on the scale necessarily of the national parks, or distant, far away from where we are, but great places to get outside near where you live. And 4 that I would put out there for you are Deer Grove East, which is a wonderful forest preserve in Cook County, Waterfall Glen, which is a wonderful forest preserve in DuPage County, Sagawau Canyon, again in Cook County, and Glacial Park up in McHenry County. It's part of the McHenry County Conservation District. Those are the 4 that are visible. So shift the beat in the chat to thinking a little bit about where we like to get outside, closer to home, wherever home might be for you. I want to introduce you to a tool called the Story Spine. And the Story Spine was originally created by a playwright named Ken Adams. And what he tried to do with the Story Spine in thinking about storytelling was to move it away from the realm of sort of literary criticism and theory and sort of like your English degree kind of thing, thinking about sort of those terms, and really break it down to what are sort of like the compelling outlines, the spine, if you will, of making a good story. And so the way that it works is that there are prompts. So it starts with the platform. That's the sort of once upon a time, sort of the everyday, the kind of setting up the structure of sort of what is the status quo as the story begins. Then it moves on into the catalyst, the sort of but one day. So something occurs that sort of switches up and changes that status quo. And then what are the consequences of that? So because of that, this happens. And because of that, the next thing happens. And because of that, the thing after that happens, leading up to the climax of the story until finally. And then the resolution. So sort of what has changed because of the events of the story ever since then, and the moral of the story. So thinking back to my anecdote, not even really a story about my downstairs neighbor and her impression of nature in the Midwest, a way to run it through the Story Spine might look something like this. So once upon a time, Sean and I were arriving home, and we ran into our neighbor. On that day, she looked at our hiking gear and was confused. And she said, "Oh, it looks like you've been hiking." We said, "Well, yes. We were down in the Dewan National Tallgrass Prairie." Because we said that, she looked even more confused and said, "We love hiking, but we didn't think there was anywhere to go hiking in the Midwest." Now that's where my original version of the story ended. But the Story Spine invites me, encourages me on to take it further. So what happened because of that? Because of that, I got thinking about how people don't actually often know the great places to get outside in the Chicago region. Because of that, Sean and I started a group amongst our friends where we would pick one Saturday a month between May and October to pick a place to get outside within a couple of hours of Chicago, to expose more people to great places to get outside. Because of that, that led to a group of 50 people who were part of that. Because of that, I realized that there was definitely an audience for this type of thing in our region. And because of that, in the course of my day job at the time, we developed an interactive map of places to get outside in the Chicago region. Finally, then there was a tool for people to use. And ever since then, we've been able to point people to this go-to tool. And all of that is because our downstairs neighbor came out of her house and happened to catch us coming home in hiking gear. So you see how the story spine invited me to go further and actually create a full narrative arc to my story. If you have any questions as we're going along about the story spine, and at the end, I'm going to share the story spine and 2 other tools that we're going to talk about today. As a PDF, I'll send the link near the end before we say goodbye for today, so you'll have a copy of the story spine. But here's some more stories. I'm going to tell a few more stories and run them through some of these tools. So please do throw some questions out, throw some observations out, but let's move on to the next story. Oop. There we go. In the fall of 2014, as part of our journey to all the national parks, Sean and I visited the Dakotas. And in this 10-day trip, we went to Badlands National Park, Wind Cave National Park, and Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We also threw in Devil's Tower National Monument across the border in Wyoming, but mostly we were in the Dakotas. And we camped our first night there in a primitive camping area, although car camping was part of it, called Sage Creek Campground. I cannot recommend Sage Creek Campground at Badlands National Park enough. It's at the far sort of west end. It's surrounded entirely by the Sage Creek wilderness, except for the road into the campground and the campground proper. The rest is all federally protected wilderness, far from the main sort of park's campground, which is on the east end of the park. And when we were there, we noticed as we were setting up camp that a sort of loose group of male bison kind of wandered into camp. It wasn't a herd, it wasn't, females and young bison. It was sort of a group of kind of bachelor males. It felt like they weren't all together, but they were all around, kind of generally there. And so, they bedded down across the road from our campsite, and we went to bed. And I awoke before sunrise to the sound of birdsong echoing from either side of the shallow valley of Sage Creek Campground. Brilliant, hearty, melodic birdsong, which I would later realize came from western meadowlarks. Sean was still sleeping, so I carefully rolled out of my tent, put on my boots, and zipped on my hoodie. The temperature had dropped quite a bit overnight. Sage Creek Campground is situated as a large oval with pit toilets at the north and south ends, and most of the tent sites within the middle of the oval. It was almost completely surrounded by the federally designated Sage Creek wilderness. The bison that we'd seen bed down the previous evening were up and grazing quietly in the growing light. The campground was still quiet, so I settled in at the picnic table, facing outward east to catch the sunrise. I practiced and played around with various lenses in the half light. While I waited, particularly, I tested different exposures to capture a huge bull bison that was grazing along toward the south, just across the road from our campsite. Everything was quiet, save for the singing of the meadowlarks and the sound of the bison munching prairie grass. Then the bison I was focusing on turned suddenly and walked up onto the road. I thought, oh good, he's going to walk along the road to join some other bison grazing near the southern end of the campground. I can get some good shots of him out of the tall grass. But then when he was about even with where I was standing, he turned suddenly and headed purposefully, calmly, but unmistakably toward me. I froze in a moment of disbelief, but then quickly moved to the other side of the picnic table from him. He continued right up and stopped just on the other side of the picnic table, turning his head to look at me, just quietly assessing me, and occasionally snorting gently. His beard was damp from the morning dew on the grass he'd been eating, and his hot breath clouded in the chill air. I was thrilled, but my heart was pounding with adrenaline. I did manage to reach out and grab a different lens. This image was taken with a telephoto lens still on my camera in order to better capture how close he was standing. At one point, he burped. He continued standing there, regarding me for several moments. I didn't want to call out for Sean to look out of the tent because I didn't want to startle the bison. Sean would say later that he was half awake while this was happening and heard the bison snorting, but thought that he was still across the road. I also didn't want to just stand there snapping photos, so I set the camera down while we stared at each other. Then, with another gentle snort, he turned to the southeast and headed back up, over, and across the road to continue grazing. I snapped the photo below, the photo here, from where the bison had just been standing looking at me from across the picnic table. So this was the bison's eye view, and I had been on the other side of the picnic table. After he'd left and my heart had stopped beating in my ears, I settled back in for the sunrise, which was throwing gorgeous light across the valley. Once the sun was up, the campground began stirring in earnest. The bison who'd visited me started snorting at another bull who was grazing near him, also just across the road from us. Tails went up and more earnest snorting began. At this point, I loudly whispered, "Sean, Sean, wake up," because I didn't want him to miss whatever altercation was about to take place. The second bull began wallowing, which is a sign of deflection in a potential encounter, and soon they both calmed down and continued grazing. Soon the morning coffee was percolating. So thinking about that story, how would it fit in the story spine? So once upon a time, went to Badlands National Park. So it's a little bit tougher. So there are just more decisions to be kind of made here. So I could frame the story in the story spine in thinking about how to put it in there, knowing that the climax is going to be the encounter with the bison. I could start out further that Sean and I, camp in the national parks all the time. That's sort of like the standard way that we think about, sort of like the status quo. But one day in a campsite, a bison came over to me. Even though they say stay away from the bison, they don't say quite what to do when the bison comes into your campsite. Because of that, I moved around the other side of the picnic table. Because of that, I was terrified and thrilled. Because of that, the bison seemed to just want to see what I was up to until finally the bison walked away. Ever since then, this story has become a touchstone for me in my life. So that's one way to do it. There are other ways to do it. Another way to think about it, here's another strategy, and again, I'll share this out as a resource at the end. It's called the SWBST strategy, which is a terrible, terrible name, but it stands for somebody wanted, but so that. And so the idea there is to think about your story, think about what you want to tell, think about what you want to convey, and think about sort of who is the main character. So I would say that I'm the main character. What does the main character want? The main character wants to get beautiful nature photography here in this campground, here in this beautiful national park. What is the main problem or conflict? A bison has walked over and is preventing the main character from taking photos as he would like to of the sunrise because he has had to move around to the other side of the picnic table. How does the problem get solved? They stand there until the bison gets tired of staring at him and the bison walks away. What was the result or the outcome? Some amazing photos and sort of a connection with bison for the main character. Another way to think about it is who is the main character? The main character could be the bison in this. Now, I know are issues of sort of thinking about an anthropomorphizing animals, but bear with me for a second, because we know that the bison did a couple of things. The bison pretty overtly turned and walked over to see what I was doing. So there was some sort of sense of, motivation with the bison. So if the bison is the main character, what does the main character want? The main character wants to see what this, human is doing over there at that picnic table. And so the bison goes over, and the problem or conflict is how will the human react to the bison? And the human goes around to the other side of the table until finally, the result or the outcome from that encounter is that nothing bad happens, something kind of cool happens. The bison gets bored, realizes that the human isn't worth, worrying about, and walks away. So that's a way to think about that story, and tell it in a different way. Let's do another one. So this is a photo of the Chisos Mountains. They are the southernmost mountain range in the United States. They are in South Texas in Big Bend National Park. So to get to Big Bend from Chicago, what we did was fly to El Paso and then drive 10 hours from El Paso down along essentially the route of the Rio Grande to that great sweep that the Rio Grande makes in South Texas. And that's where Big Bend is nestled along the border with Mexico and along the Rio Grande. After a morning spent exploring Burro Mesa and striking our camp at Cottonwood, we drove to the heart of Big Bend National Park, Chisos Basin. We had reserved our backcountry campsite the day before and planned to hike into the mountains for an overnight backpack trip. I wanted to wake up the following morning, November 12th, on my 35th birthday in the Chisos Mountains. Multiple times over the preceding days, we had driven the park roads in a great arc north of the Chisos, but this time we turned south onto the road that ran up into the center of the mountains. The road rose steadily up over the northern slopes into a canyon called Green Gulch. A delicate set of power lines ran along the road, providing electricity to the visitor center, store, and lodge in the basin. As the elevation increased, the vegetation became steadily greener and more lush. Up we went into the Chisos with jagged spire-like peaks rising on either side. They reminded me of photos of mountains in China, both in the deep burnt sienna of the rock and in the evergreens of various species clinging to them. The road began twisting into a series of sharp switchbacks as we climbed Panther Pass and then descended into the basin. We parked at the trailhead, approximately 5,400 feet of elevation, stopped into the store to grab some Cliff Bars and to have the snacks, and shouldered our backpacks, which, because we had to carry all our water, were very, very heavy, and set out. Our destination was Colima 3 Campground, one of the 3 along Colima Trail in the forests of the south side of Emery Peak, about 5 miles away. We began the hike at just about 2:30 p.m. and arrived at the campground 2.5 hours later, just before 5 p.m. 5 miles, 2,000 feet elevation gain, 2.5 hours. We pushed ourselves because, in honesty, we started too late and we were worried about losing the light before we were able to set up camp. Our intention was simply to make it to camp, and then the next morning, with a home base in the mountains, have time to hike out to the south rim and perhaps to the top of Emery Peak before heading back down to the basin in the afternoon. Of the 2 major trails into the High Chisos, we chose Laguna Meadow Trail because, although it has the same 2,000 feet elevation gain, it achieves it more steadily and less steeply. Throughout the basin and at other points along the trail were warnings and guides to safety in bear and mountain lion country. Black bears were not always present in the Chisos during the history of the park. During the 1980s, bears crossed the Rio Grande from the Sierra del Carmen in Mexico to make the Chisos Mountains their home. Laguna Meadow Trail led us quickly up and out of the basin. Looking back, we could see through the window the westerly facing gap in the mountains that provides the only drainage from the basin. We were switchbacking up Laguna Meadow Trail, still within sight of the lodge buildings, when Sean, who had been in front but was now behind since I'd requested a slower pace, said, "There's an insect on your backpack." "What kind of insect?" I asked. "A butterfly," he replied. "Take a photo." We stopped. He snapped a few photos of the yellow-green butterfly, and we continued on, assuming, like most times, that a curious dragonfly or a shy moth landed on us during a hike, that it would soon fly away. Some 45 minutes later, he mentioned that the insect was still there. The Chisos Mountains, formed by ancient volcanoes and rising many thousands of feet above the Chihuahuan Desert, are like an island of green in a sea of desert. Many of the species found in these mountains, such as quaking aspen, were stranded as the region warmed at the end of the last ice age. Some of these stranded species have evolved into distinct species and subspecies endemic to these mountains or to the Chisos and the neighboring Sierra del Carmen. Other species, such as yucca and ocotillo, are rare in mountain habitats, but are found here along with pines, junipers, and oaks because they have traveled up from the desert floor. The mix is splendidly fragrant and wildly fascinating in its juxtapositions. Up and up we hiked along Laguna Meadow Trail, growing wearier and warmer. Each time I asked, "Is it still there?" the reply came back, "Yes." Even when we stopped to rest, munching on the trail mix while we were sitting on rock walls that the trail dogs had built to create the switchbacks, the butterfly was still there. Even when I'd stopped at practically every switchback, bending over with the weight of my pack to stretch my hamstrings and catch my breath as we reached the high ridge of the Colima Trail near our campsite, the butterfly was still there. As we climbed, the play of light in the mountains from a partly cloudy afternoon was intoxicating. After about almost a mile, Colima Trail cut to the left. Our campsite was now only about a half mile away. Unfortunately, much of that half mile was uphill in a series of steep switchbacks that would bring us to our highest elevation of the hike, just about 7,400 feet. By this time, I was having a truly rough time of it, having to stop frequently to catch my breath, but we continued on. After we reached the final ridge of our hike, the switchbacks ended and the trail dropped in a gradual decline through forest. We almost missed the small sign and spur trail to our campsite, but suddenly there we were. We'd made it. All the campsites in the Chisos are primitive backcountry sites with bare boxes and flat areas for pitching tents. Unlike the vast majority of the park, where backcountry camping is permitted virtually anywhere, here it is limited to the designated reservable sites. Fires are prohibited. These restrictions help to protect the fragile mountain ecosystems and ensure that human campsites are spread far from each other. Our site was at about 7,150 feet, not even 700 feet below Emery Peak, the highest point in Big Bend, immediately to our north. I carefully slid my pack from my shoulders, and the butterfly was still there. In addition to riding up the mountains, it had been tasting the salt in my sweat on my pack. It wasn't the only hitchhiker. An inchworm had been enjoying the view from the brim of my hat, and a little brockamina had been napping on my hat's interior. Both of these I shook out to make their fortunes here in camp, but the butterfly I let be. Night fell, it grew chill, and we ate our supper. Before turning in, I covered my pack with its rain cover. Since the butterfly hadn't flown away, although it had moved to a slightly more sheltered position, I placed the cover loosely over the pack to protect both it and the butterfly, but left the cover still open enough that the butterfly could leave if it wished. In the growing light before dawn, we were awakened by a soft rain. We made sure that our gear was covered and climbed back into our sleeping bags to doze for another hour or so. At 7:30, I woke up in earnest. Outside our tent, it had stopped raining, but the mist had rolled in, making the world chilly and moody and destroying any visibility. Throughout the pre-dawn rain and the arrival of the mist and clouds, the butterfly was still there. Although it was so misty, it was also breezy, and the billows of clouds and mist were blowing up the adjacent slopes so that Emery Peak just above us was alternately visible and shrouded. We took our time making coffee and preparing breakfast, hoping that the clouds and mist would eventually clear. While we were waiting for the coffee to finish percolating, 2 deer, a doe and likely her surviving fawn from that spring, wandered into our camp, browsing vegetation. I wouldn't say they were unconcerned by us, but they didn't spook while I would try to get a good photo. Throughout it all, the butterfly was still there. We gave up hope of seeing the spectacular views from the South Rim and decided to head back down before the weather worsened. Filling our water bottles and bladders, we used the end of our water. It turned out that we had planned well in that respect. It also made for significantly lighter packs for the return trip. We set out. For the descent, we took Colima Trail to Boot Spring Trail and then Pinnacles Trail back into the basin, essentially creating a big loop over 2 days of hiking. The return trip was 5¼ miles, dropped about 1,900 feet in elevation, and took us about 2 hours and 15 minutes. As we descended, we were basically heading north with the obscured easterly vistas to our right. Even more than on the other side of the Chisos and Laguna Meadow Trail, it felt like we were passing through distinct pocket ecosystems. As we hiked back down out of the high Chisos, I left the rain cover off my pack so that the butterfly could easily fly away if it wanted to. It didn't. Down past an ephemeral spring, down past Emery Peak, down past the Big Tooth Maple Grove, down past wildflowers, down past steep switchbacks, down past Juniper Flat, the butterfly was still there. Occasionally, I'd ask Sean to check on the butterfly, and each time it was still there. We reached the spur trail to the top of Emery Peak. There was little point of climbing it. The abysmal visibility forced us to look more closely at the details along the trail, which were captivating. As we finally descended into the Chisos Basin proper, into the lower level of the clouds, the wind picked up and the temperature grew chillier. The moisture in the clouds was more tangibly turning to rain. Sean kept an eye on the butterfly, reporting that with some of the strong gusts, it was being whipped around pretty violently, but still it clung to my pack. On Tuesday afternoon, November 12th, not long before we concluded my big birthday backpack into the high Chisos Mountains, we were switchbacking down Pinnacles Trail, now within sight of the lodge buildings, when Sean, who had been in front but was now behind since I was feeling sure on my feet, cried, "It's gone!" The butterfly had flown away into the same wildflower-laden slope of the Chisos Basin we'd been passing through when it landed on my backpack to taste some salt the day before. It had joined us for a birthday adventure and returned home. And despite the clouds and actually snow that moved in to the Chisos and Big Bend National Park that day, it made for a moody desert for the rest of our trip, which was beautiful, beautiful, beautiful in its own way. So thinking about our tools and thinking about how to adapt the story using the tools, again, here, the main character could be me. You could tell it from Sean's point of view. You could tell it from the butterfly's point of view. You could also tell this story from the main character being the Chisos Mountains itself, and the complex and sort of thinking it like a mountain, as Aldo Leopold would say, and thinking about these two people and a butterfly climbing up into the mountains and then coming back out of the mountains. In that sense, what does the main character want, depending on who it is? The butterfly wanted the salt of my pack. I wanted to be in the mountains for my birthday. Sean wanted to go on a great hike. The mountains didn't want anything from us. What is the problem or conflict? It also, again, depends on who you're talking to. You could frame the conflict as sort of the struggle we had getting up there, particularly me. It was an incredibly hard hike. The conflict or problem could be wanting to protect the butterfly. And I'm noticing, sorry, I have to, Barb, you caught my attention. I just was checking the chat about the moose on Isle Royal. We should talk about Isle Royal. It's an amazing park. Sorry to interrupt there. How does the problem get solved? Again, it depends on how we frame it. This experience that happened, and in this way, in thinking about the SWBST strategy, or this way of thinking about telling story, as you'll note, what I'm doing right now is trying to find meaning within that story, trying to sort of impose and interpret meaning on something that just simply happened to us. We took a hike, there was a butterfly on the pack, and the butterfly stayed with us almost 24 hours and then left in the same spot that it had been. Here's another tool. It's called the Storytelling Canvas. And this is a little bit more oriented toward journalism, but it's useful and it's part of the toolkit that we're going to share with you. And what's great about the Storytelling Canvas is that it forces you to kind of think in some of those standard kind of forms of thinking about story, about an article, about journalism, about how to convey information to people. So the information piece of it is that classic who, what, when, where, why, and how. So who, two guys and a butterfly. What, went for a hike. When, on one of their birthdays. Where, the Chisos Mountains. Why, because they like adventure and salt. How, through a lot of exertion. it also helps you think about audience. So thinking about target audience. So who is a target audience? And that changes. So the version of the story that I read to you is a version that's on the blog. But I've also adapted the story for other media. And then also I was editing and kind of changing the story a bit today for this telling to you. In fact, on the blog, the story is split into two things. I don't mention the butterfly at all in the main narrative of going up and down the mountains, and then talk about the butterfly exclusively in a second version of the story. What do you want to achieve? Want to, inspire people and teach them a little bit about a lice-eyed sulfur butterfly that stayed with us on this hike. Characters, or sorry, then the story itself, who are the characters? We've laid that out. What is the conflict? Again, the story spine helped us think about that. Where is there a connection? I feel that there was some sort of bizarre connection between this insect and the two of us. And then sort of what is the baseline? Again, that's sort of that idea from the story spine about sort of what is the platform, what is the once upon a time, what is the setting, sort of what is that everyday situation. And then this tool also helps us think a little bit about format and design and tone of voice. So design is a little bit about what I was talking about a moment ago, that you can split the butterfly narrative out of the hiking narrative in this story. What is the channel? Again, the blog, this webinar, me sharing the story and speaking the story to you. What is the tone of voice? Again, that's whose perspective is it? My tone of voice, I think, is very informational and sort of a bit anecdotal and a bit self-deprecating in the way that I talk about. Like, I didn't have to talk about the struggle that I had going up those switchbacks and how at that point it was like the hardest hike of my life. It isn't anymore. That was 7 years ago. Definitely been on harder hikes than that now. But again, I didn't have to include that information in. It's part of what I wanted to include, partly to be that little bit of self-deprecating piece there. This is the slide where I am trying to decide how we're doing with time. And I think that we are okay. And here it's going to be a little bit looser. And I'm realizing that I put the slides in the wrong order in this section. So I'm going to go backwards. Okay, there we go. So I want to tell you about a very special place near us. It's Rome Pond Natural Area in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. It's a Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources land. Very, very special place. Small. It's a little bit of oak hickory woodland, some rolling cames, glacial cames, and then marsh surrounding a pond. And every year for the past 19 years until 2020, I would go with friends in Wisconsin, friends who would come from Detroit, with Sean to participate in the annual Midwest Sandhill Crane Count that takes place every April, sort of the Saturday in the middle of April, unless it's Easter, on that particular weekend, from 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning, being in a marsh, counting cranes. And it happens all across the Midwest. I'm curious, any of you who are in the Midwest, if you have participated in the crane count. It is the longest ongoing citizen conservation effort in North America. And it happens across parts of Michigan, parts of Illinois and Indiana, parts of Minnesota, and sort of like all of Wisconsin, this annual count. And it is a very, very special, peaceful place. Yes, Sandra counts cranes in McHenry, exactly. So you know what we're talking about, what I'm talking about. And so it's very much part of our year. It's very much part of our tradition. It's very much part of our welcoming spring. It's very much part of this experience of these friends who come from Michigan, where Sean and I are both from, up to Wisconsin to other friends, and make a weekend out of it. And in this year, it was taken from us. Because for the first time ever, the crane count had to be canceled because it was happening in the middle of April. And the International Crane Foundation that organizes the count said it's too dangerous because of COVID-19. They were canceling the count, so we did not have it this year. There are friends from Michigan and their kid, and their kid had never missed. Little Sylvan, who's now 4, had never missed a crane count until this year when it didn't happen. And so, very bummed about that and staying here, in lockdown, in COVID. Sean and I are both here in our apartment, sort of all the time as we are, this afternoon, and with me talking to you. And one of the benefits of sort of being here during COVID was, and not running off to the national parks and not running off to see sort of nature, even away from our block and our neighborhood, was getting a sense of nature here and sort of the rhythms of nature here in the city. I mean, we had known that there's a Cooper's hawk that lives, a family of Cooper's hawks that live on our block. We see them chasing sparrows from under cars, in the Jewel parking lot. I've actually seen a Cooper's hawk flush a house sparrow out from underneath a Prius over here in the Jewel parking lot 4 blocks away. So we definitely know that there's nature here. And one of the most delightful things about nature in our neighborhood is the screaming of the nighthawks. So every year, the common nighthawks return to our neighborhood in Chicago from South America and Central America, where they winter, and spend the evenings. They sleep during the day and they spend the evenings swooping about in the twilight, screaming and making sonic booms as they dive, as they're catching insects. So they do it, they're crepuscular, so they do it at night or at twilight, they do it in the morning, just before dawn. And I like to tell people that the sound of the nighthawk screaming lulls me to bed in the summer and wakes me from slumber in the morning, the screaming of the nighthawks. And there's a photo of a nighthawk, not from our neighborhood though. I got that one in Glacier National Park. But this year, on one random day in June, I went to go outside on our little back porch up here on the 3rd floor where our apartment is, and freaked out as I opened the back door because there was a nighthawk just sitting there on the railing of our balcony. And I went and got Sean, like, oh my gosh, Sean, hang up with your meeting. Come, you have to go see this. You have to see this. Very quietly, carefully reached out and took a photo, snapped a photo of the nighthawk. And was very excited. Then I had a meeting. I was telling people on my meeting about the nighthawk, and there was a nighthawk out there. And it just stayed there. It just stayed. It just stayed there. It dozed throughout the afternoon. At one point, it turned around and I'll answer that in a second, Georgianne. It turned around, so that was very exciting. Sort of, after it had been around for like 8 hours on the back porch, it turned around and it moved the other way, and it was thrilling. And eventually, it stayed with us it was with us on our back porch for almost 14 hours until it finally at twilight. I mean, at this point, Sean and I were able to actually be outside, kind of looking at it while it was over there. And then finally, it got up. And it stretched and it yawned and it spread its wings and it flew off, made this little boom and started shrieking with one of its mates and flew around. And so I thought that, in this year of COVID, it's something that I would not ever have noticed. I would have been out and about. I would have been downtown. I wouldn't have been here to see it. I don't know if the nighthawk, often, in years past would hang out on our back porch or on our roof or wherever it would spend the day. So it was a sort of little gift that COVID gave us in a very terrible year, in a year where I wasn't able to commune with my cranes, but was able to commune with this nighthawk. Georgianne, I see your question in the chat. And no, it isn't technically an actual sonic boom. They don't go fast enough. But what happens is they dive very quickly, and the wind blowing through their feathers and the way their feathers are designed make a sort of a boom noise that sounds like a sonic boom. It's very distinct, kind of like boom as they go. But we just call it a sonic boom for shorthand. So there was my little anecdote. Let me get us back to the structure. So using the storytelling canvas, which again is a little bit, odd. I was like, do I want to use this one for this? Sure. So using the storytelling canvas, thinking about who, what, when, where, why, and how I would structure this into something that was more of a cohesive narrative, there are ways to approach it. Thinking about the who's. The who's could be, Sean and me and our encounters with birds, and kind of thinking about it from that lens. The who here could be, our friends who participate from Detroit and from Wisconsin, in nature, and then this sort of separation between them. The what is the sort of connection with birds, this connection in our region with these special birds that migrate in for one time of the year and migrate out for another time of the year. When 2020, in this year of COVID, where in the Midwest, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, why the motivations there? Why did the Nighthawks stay here? Why could we not do crane count because of COVID? Thinking about how would you thread that into the story, the how, the sort of what happens, the target audience. Here, this target audience is you, the sort of audience of folks who think about conservation, who like to be on these webinars that the Conservation Foundation puts out. This is definitely, me kind of thinking this through for you as audience. So in this instance, you are the audience, and the assumptions that I make about you, the assumptions I make about me, talking to you. What do I want to achieve? I want to share this piece of happiness in COVID. Then the story, thinking about those characters like I was talking about. Is there a conflict? Is the conflict between sort of the experience of nature in COVID? Is that a way to frame this story? Where are those connections, that connection between people and nature, which is sort of foundational. It goes going back through all of the threads of stories, all these encounters with wildlife that I am sharing with you today, and all the way back to our original kind of musings and reactions to Coyote and the Beetle at the beginning of today's session, that sort of connection with nature and thinking about nature as these stories that people have been telling, for millennia upon millennia, going all the way back to, gathering around the campfire, in the way that playwright Paula Vogel has so artfully framed it as, gathering around a campfire to see a story told. Often those stories were about the interaction that people have with nature. What is the baseline? The baseline is, in this sense, sort of this strange collective year of COVID-19, where I have this thing that happened with this Nighthawk coming and hanging out with us, in this context of a Zoom webinar that this series that Jamie created in March as a reaction to the lockdown and COVID that is continuing, sort of thinking about this way of communally experiencing nature with each other and sharing nature as the year comes to an end. So again, these are all sorts of ways to think about telling these stories and telling your stories. And so I do hope, that you find these resources useful and food for thought, and that in an in-person version of a workshop or a webinar like this, we would practice, and I'd be hearing some of your stories too. And I would love to encourage you to use these resources and these tools to think about how you tell stories, to think about how you tell stories with your family on Zoom, your family gathered together over the holidays, with your friends, with your colleagues going out through 2021. Before we move into questions, I want to share sort of one more version of a story with you. So bookending, we began with Coyote and the Beetle, a Zuni story, captured by an anthropologist in the late 19th century. And I want to leave you with this story in the form of a poem. And the work that you see in front of you is called Yosemite Moon. It is by the Japanese-American artist Kira Obata, who was born in 1885. He died in 1975. And he was a well-known Japanese-American artist and popular art teacher. He emigrated to the United States in 1903 and embarked on a 7-decade career that saw the enactment of anti-immigration laws and the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. A self-described roughneck, Obata went to the United States in 1903 at age 17. After initially working as an illustrator and commercial decorator, he had a successful career as a painter, following a 1927 summer spent in the Sierra Nevada, and was faculty member in the art department at the University of California, Berkeley from 1932 to 1954, interrupted by World War II when he spent a year in an internment camp. After his retirement, he continued to paint and to lead group tours to Japan to see gardens and art. He nevertheless emerged as a leading figure in the Northern California art scene and as an influential educator, teaching at the University of California, Berkeley for nearly 20 years and acting as founding director of the art school at the Topaz internment camp. So as we consider his painting from Yosemite, from the Sierra Nevada, you see those granite, that rendering of the granite rocks of the Sierra Nevada, the monoliths of Yosemite, we see the two ponderosa pines and we see the moon. I'm going to read you a poem, Kiura Obata's Moon by Gary Snyder. Walking along the noisy, busy North Lake Tahoe Shoreline Highway, 7 p.m. Early October, late dusk, rickety houses, old motels on the lakeshore side of the street, a plastic orange fencing keeps out those who would try to get at the beach where they're building some whole new set of structures for the tourists. I'm at the Firelight Lodge, cramped for space and built around a pool that's empty. The clerk, a slender blonde with an accent, Polish, she says, but she's been here now years and plans to stay. She's pretty. She knows the life of youth in the water and snow world of Lake Tahoe. Walking up on a sign says Sancho's Tacos, a tiny storefront in a house. Off to the southwest, planet Venus, really bright, sky so clear and purple violet tonight, 2 pine trunks and that early crescent moon, the silhouetted ponderosa pine, mature and tall. I make my way into Sancho's. I hadn't planned to, but it's got a menu more than tacos. 3 youthful outdoor-clad enthusiasts just come back from some ridgetop hike are laughing and drinking in the corner. Sancho's an Anglo with a little beard and a sardonic smile. I decide to go for a dinner, a whole cooked tilapia. Never saw that on a Mexican menu before. Shades of Jack and Nancy Todd, some article 30 years ago on the freshwater tilapia, cousin of minnows, first from Africa, you could raise in your greenhouse in tubs. The fish that might help us all back to the landers get virtuous protein, maybe feed the world as well. Looking south toward the darkening lake and the murmur of trail gossip just at my back, it's the right place to be. The tilapia rice and beans dinner comes hot and it's good. Outside on the deck, the moon and Venus have shifted. I see Kiura Obata's woodblock of dusk at Yosemite, dated 1930. The soaring blue cliffs, the pines, the new moon. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Again, I am Brandon, and you see where my logo, Bold Bison, comes from, that bison in Badlands National Park. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have any questions or conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Brandon. That was awesome. I love hearing the descriptions of your travels. And I have to say, I absolutely love your use of adjectives. It's something I think we don't think of very often, but the placement of a descriptive adjective can really lend a sort of warmth or emotion or what have you to a story. When you were describing the bison, talking about, the gentle snorts, as you were talking about the bison coming closer, I could feel myself going, "Oh, that's not good," and
that was
because that can be a very dangerous thing. But your use of adjectives calmed the situation down, and I think really helped to convey the calmness of the situation and the fact that, while that can be a very dangerous situation, perhaps in this context, it was going to be okay.
I love that. I love that. I had not thought of that. So thank you for lifting sort of my adjective choice up as something, that helps to calm the listener down. I really like that. I am putting in the chat a link to the PDF, a PDF that has the 3 storytelling resources on it for attendees, if you would like to have those resources as a PDF. There they are for you.
Great. Thank you for
Any
that.
other questions, comments? Having a look at the chat. And I'm a little bit hoarse. I'm sorry after talking for over an hour. From Susie, we have Brandon. Thank you. Storytelling scares me a little. I think the one resource for story structure will be helpful for me. Great, Susie. I found them really useful. Like even especially, when I'm doing stories about the parks, I'm doing stories, on the blog. Often it's for me, I can share the story as I want. But when I'm thinking about telling a story that I know others are going to be listening to, or thinking about telling a story, especially in the conservation sector for others, I think kind of checking my story against a tool like the Story Spine can be really a useful way to like make sure that I'm hitting all the things that I think that I might be hitting.
And yeah, as someone who is also somewhat of a professional storyteller, through my work as an environmental educator, through the presentations that I give, it's very helpful to have a tool like that as something to kind of think about, because I know there are some stories I have that are better than others, and the ones that I feel maybe a little more boring, it helps me to think more about, okay, how can I jazz this up a little bit? How can I, emphasize this conflict and my word choice and things like that to help, the story has meaning to me, and to help to convey that meaning then to others.
Absolutely. And I think, often when we're thinking in terms of conservation, we're often thinking about us, or like the organization or the educator or the human in the space. And I think, playing, like I was talking a little bit about, playing with, can a non-human participant be the main character, even if we're not, potentially putting or attributing motivations to a non-human actor. You can create a story that's like literally about, where the butterfly is the main character on my backpack, without giving the butterfly any internal life that we would not possibly know, but still kind of like keeping the butterfly as sort of the main way to frame the story too.
Yeah.
So it can be kind of a way to think about that, and a little bit more creatively.
Well, and
instead of sort of like, yeah.
I found that very interesting too, because as you were telling that story, you mentioned the butterfly, and like, oh yeah, as you can tell, I like butterflies, and so, oh, that was cool. And then, the second time you mentioned the butterfly, like, oh, and so then as the story went on, I was like, wait, what happened to the butterfly? Is the butterfly still there? And then, okay, yeah, the butterfly's still there. Okay. and it just, it was almost like a way to shift the focus of the story onto the butterfly, and away from yourself, and not just a story about a couple of guys going hiking. Okay.
Yeah.
But now there's a butterfly.
Well, and it's funny too, when Sean asked me like, which stories are you going to share? Because, the blog, God help me, is like 300,000 words at this point, the whole thing. But he said, like, which stories are you going to tell? I said, oh, the bison and the butterfly is like perfect, and so, it wasn't, half the hikes he doesn't remember. If I say like, oh, remember the hike we did at Guadalupe and like blah, 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 like, no, I don't remember that one. But the butterfly absolutely makes it absolutely memorable. And again, it much more interesting, to your point, than just some random hike that we went on, that makes it that anchor and that hook.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
I see also in the chat from Leisha Johnson, thank you. I need to share this with all my teacher friends who teach writing courses. This was fabulous. Thank you very much for your kind words, Leisha. It's funny, telling stories about the national parks, writing about the national parks, thinking about the national parks is something I do kind of totally on the side. I do this apart from sort of my professional life, because it's definitely a passion. And so I was so thrilled, with Jamie's invitation to talk about storytelling and her openness to me talking about the national parks to kind of share them in this way. It really was. I was very nervous because it was so personal.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great. All right. Well, Brandon, I think I have heard you talk about the story spine before. I think I have that document, but if you want to email it to me, those of you, if you weren't able to screenshot, or if you're watching this on YouTube and you didn't catch it, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to send you a copy of that. My email address is JV like Victor, IE, B like boy, ACH at theconservationfoundation.org. It is the longest email ever. I apologize, but that's what it is. So drop me an email and I'd be happy to send it out to you.
And I will throw out a quick shout out. Thank you to the Conservation Foundation for doing this series, for making this effort to keep people connected to conservation and nature, in this bizarre year of 2020. And as we approach the end of, and Jamie did not ask me to do this, as we approach the end of 2020, the end of the year, this is a great time to, if you're thinking about giving a gift and making a donation to a great organization that does a lot for conservation in the Chicago region, the Conservation Foundation should be that organization. And I know that they would greatly benefit and greatly appreciate it. So please do consider a donation as we reach the end of the year.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for making this a really fantastic webinar series and a fantastic year. This is truly what's been keeping me going in 2020. I mean, it's given me something to do and giving me something really positive to focus on, and all of the kind messages from everyone as I've been doing this series has been absolutely amazing. So thank you all. And I hope you all have a fabulous holiday season and a fantastic new year. And I will see you all again in 2021. So thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.